There's a really interesting study that was done a couple of years ago that was called How Did That Happen? And yes, I put the zhuzh on that title. Teachers' explanations for low test scores. And what these researchers were interested in doing was analyzing the recorded transcripts of professional learning community teams from all across the country over the course of the year. And what they were interested in looking at specifically is what happened in the conversation whenever data were presented in that professional learning community team. Keep in mind that the data are primarily the data that are teacher-generated data. In other words, how was it that students did on a chapter test or a unit test, as well as some of the benchmark or interim assessments that are done. Not only those state or in some cases national tests being done, but lots of different assessments along the way. So I've set up this study, right? What did teachers talk about when data were presented? And what they found were that 85% of the time, there were deficits in those discussions. 33% of the explanations were around student behavior. In other words, well, he didn't do good on this science test that we gave because, he never pays attention. At other times, a mismatch between the assessment demands and the student. Well, he's an English language learner. They never do well on this benchmark. Or talking about the student's home life. They don't read to her at home, blaming the family. And in other cases, either suspected or established underlying conditions. It was surprising, these researchers found, how often there were conversations that were speculative around dyslexia and other learning disabilities. 85% of the time, when teachers were confronted with data, they moved immediately from what the teaching could be to what were the student characteristics. Only 15% of the time did teachers actually move into the space of being able to figure out what has worked well, who benefited and who did not, what were some of the practices that were successful, how might we address some of those practices again in the future. Now, I want to be really clear about this. These are not uncaring teachers that were involved in this research. But what it does evidence is that it's teachers who have a low sense of collective efficacy. They don't know what to do. And so therefore, in not knowing what to do, the conversation often went sideways and moved into the characteristics of the students. Having a deep sense of what a strengths-based approach is and how it is that we analyze student work in those professional learning communities is essential. And here's where protocols come into play again.